Then I think we can go straight to the next speaker. If not, there is no complaint, no other competitive meeting, which is Yoav Kessler from Ben Gurion University of the Negev, which is in Beersheba, and this is in Israel. And he is talking about control over the components of working memory, the elusive nature of working memory updating. Floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me? And can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, thank you. So, thanks a lot, Lorenza and Bernard, for organizing this conference, and thank you for the invitation. And I'd like to talk today about the work that we've been doing in my lab over the past few years on working memory updating. And after sending Lorenza the title of my talk, I thought the title might be too boring, and I asked ChatGPT for a better one. And here are some of the answers that I got. I think that number 5, where is it? Working memory updating, intentional effort, or just attention's messy side effect. And number 6, control freak or a happy accident. These really capture the essence of my talk. And also number 7, who really wears the cognitive pants? So here's another definition made up by ChatGPT. A definition for what working memory is. Working memory is the reason why you walked into the kitchen and forgot why. And I think that this experience that all of us have from time to time captures the essence of working memory. It holds active information for short durations in the service of a goal that we want to execute, but it is limited in capacity. So in order to perform correctly, we need to make sure that working memory holds the relevant information and that irrelevant information does not get in and interfere. Otherwise, the relevant information will be forgotten. Large parts of my research focus on this exact question: what gets into working memory, what does not get into working memory, and how is working memory updated with the relevant information while protecting its content from irrelevant one. Here's a preliminary pre-theoretic definition of working memory updating by Morris and Jones many years ago. It is the act of modifying the current status of a representation to accommodate new input. We know that updating is required in high-level cognitive tasks, in reasoning, in arithmetics, in comprehension, right? In situations where you need to gradually walk through stages, update working memory with the result of each step, and move forward with the solution. But more basically, updating is keeping a correspondence between working memory and the world. And in the lab, working memory updating is often studied with the NBEC task, in which people are shown with a stimuli, let's say letters, and in each trial they need to decide whether the letter they see now is the same as or different from the letter they saw n trials ago. So there's the 1-back version, the 2-back, 3-back, and so forth. In order to perform correctly, people have to continuously update their working memory with the new input while getting rid of outdated information. In the executive functions literature, working memory updating is conceived as a core executive function along with shifting and inhibition. And what's interesting is that among the three, individual differences in updating ability, but not in shifting or in inhibition, individual differences in updating ability are correlated with both fluid and crystallized intelligence. And I believe that this finding by Friedman and colleagues was a strong force driving the research on cognitive training, in which updating tasks, working memory updating tasks, and primarily the NBEC, but not only the NBEC, often utilized as training tasks. An influential modeling framework is the gating model or set of models. And this class of models assume that the contents of working memory are separated by a gate from the sensory information. So this gate is closed by default, and this allows working memory to maintain information in an intact manner, undisrupted by perceptual input. However, opening that gate, when the sensory input is relevant, opening the gate enables relevant information to enter working memory, to flow inside, and allows for updating. Normally, in this model, the gate is implemented by the firing of two groups of neurons, go and no-go neurons, in the striatum. And these neurons control the flow of information from the thalamus that serves as a hub for perceptual input to the prefrontal cortex that underlies working memory. And these models assume that maintenance is the default state of the system, so the gate is closed by default. And updating is transient, it's effortful, it requires opening the gate to working memory, and hence it is time consuming. In the past few years, our lab developed what we call the reference-back paradigm, with the purpose of teasing apart the sub-processes involved in working memory updating. Now, this paradigm builds on the end-back task. The end-back task is excellent if you want to study individual differences. However, it's a very bad task if you want to study the cognitive processes or mechanisms involved in updating. And this is because in the end-back task, people update their working memory in every trial. So this task does not have a control condition in which updating does not take place. So you cannot really compare between updating and not updating. What we did in reference-back task is to add this no update condition. So in these tasks, there are two types of trials: reference trials, cued by red frames, and comparison trials cued by blue frames. In each trial of the task, the participants need to indicate whether the letter that they see is the same as or different from the letter that appeared in the most recent red frame. So, for example, they see an X, they have to hold the X in mind, and then they see an O within a blue frame, and they have to say that it is different, but they keep maintaining that X. In the next trial, they see an O within a red frame. They have to say, right, to compare that to the reference, say that the O is different. But here, they have to update their working memory with an O because in the following trial will have to be compared to this one, right? So in order to perform correctly, people have to update their working memory with letters that appear in red frames, in reference trials, and not to update with letters that appear in blue frames in comparison trials. So response selection, the same different decision, takes place in both types of trials, but only reference trials, update trials require a working memory updating. So we can look at the difference between these two trial types and capture the process of updating. So this paradigm gives rise to two types of effects. First, update trials are slower than no update trials, and this reflects the fact that updating is time-consuming, as said before. And second, the transition between the two conditions, switching between updating and not updating, correspond to opening and closing the gate to working memory. So whenever you move from no update to an update trial, you have to open the gate for input, and when you move from update to no update, you have to close this gate. And these switches are also associated with response time costs and with neural activation in the thalamus, in the striatum, and in the prefrontal cortex, as predicted by the gating model. Here's another result. In another study, we observed the same effects with eye blink rates during the task performance. We know that eye blink rates are indicators of dopaminergic activity in the brain, so people blink more here in this task. During update trials, than no update, they blink more when they need to change the state of the gate, and this again supports the gating model, which suggests that dopaminergic activity in the striatum is responsible for the gating activity and for working memory updating. So the finding regarding the cost of updating was replicated many times, both in our lab, in other labs, again and again, using the reference spec task and other tasks, suggesting that working memory updating is an effortful and controlled process. However, and this is the fun and more novel part of the story, there's another side to it. So a few years ago, together with Sam Verschuren from Ghent University, we were interested in the question of what is the default state, the default mode of the system. Whether it's harder to close the gate than open it, or vice versa, or are these costs comparable? And also, is it possible to change this default? And to this end, we examined the interaction between updating and gating. So these are right update and no update trials. These are repetitions of the same condition, switches between condition, and that interaction could be under additive, maybe, right? So like here on the left, showing a switch asymmetry, suggesting that gate closing is more difficult than gate opening. It could be additive, like here on the right, suggesting these costs are comparable. And we looked at previous data and saw that both patterns existed. And actually, to our surprise, what seemed to be the critical factor, and these are real data, what seemed to be the critical factor here, determining which pattern we got, was something we never considered to be important, which was the length of the inter-trial interval. Right, the interval between a response in one trial and the appearance of the stimulus in the following trial. And specifically, we observed an under-additive interaction in short inter-trial intervals around 500 milliseconds, and an additive pattern in long ITIs. And we next moved on to replicate this finding, and it was replicated within an experiment a few times. Why is it so? The purpose of this busy slide is to show you that the answer is complicated. It has to do with the stimulus repetition effects that interact with whether the response in the present trial was same or different, and whether the response in the previous trial was same or different. Essentially, it was a highly robust five-way interaction driven by a specific condition, this one here, that for some reason was highly sensitive to the duration of the inter-trial interval, and that was driving the entire interaction we saw before. I won't get into the details of why specifically this condition. You can read them in the paper if you want, but honestly, I don't think the details are very important for the main message. But my own take from this story, this project was, well, this task is so complex, performance is so complicated by factors that I don't really care about, such as the difference between same and different responses, such as the inter-trial interval, and so forth. Let's try to make the task simpler. Let's strip off all the unnecessary complexities, remove the need to make same different responses, and get a cleaner, clearer task that would enable us to observe the processes more clearly. So we created this paradigm. It is very similar to the reference back task I showed before, with one notable difference. Here, instead of making same different judgments, all the participants have to do is to perform a choice reaction time task in each trial. Namely, they have to press the right key for an X and the left key for an O, and this is for all the trials. Again, some of the letters appeared in red frames, some of them in blue frames, and after a random sequence of trials, after a random number of trials, participants were prompted to recall the letter that appeared in the most recent red frame. Again, in order to do so, they had to update their working memory whenever a red frame appeared, and not update working memory whenever a blue frame appeared. And as before, we measured response times for these update and no update trials, expecting to see an update cost. Here are the results. Update trials are on average faster than no update trials, exactly the opposite pattern. Here in blue are participants that show this update benefit. In red, some of them showed an update cost. When you see such a result, you first go and check the software, check the analysis code, see whether there's some error. When you don't find an error, you run a replication and another one. And after quite a few replications, actually tons of replications over the past few years in my lab, you start to believe the result and try to understand what's going on. So why there is an update benefit? Why is updating faster than not updating? And by the way, speaking of individual differences, we see huge individual differences here, not only in the size of the effect, but also in its direction. There are some people who show the opposite effect, and we're currently examining whether these are reliable and whether they reflect differences in the basic tendencies that people have. So what does it mean? Why is updating faster, or basically easier, than not updating? It reminded me of my first presentation as a student at an international conference that was exactly 20 years ago at ESCOP in Leiden, 2005, that was organized by Bernard. And I presented my work on working memory updating. Could you imagine? Showing that updating is more costly than not updating, and that this cost increases with the set size. And I remember during this talk, Pierre Baroyer, who's a prominent working memory researcher, is sitting in the front row and shaking his head throughout my entire talk. And at the end of the talk, he raised his hand and said, you have to update your working memory all the time. If updating was so effortful, you would die. In other words, how can it be that updating is both so frequent and so costly? And I think today that he was right. He was right. Take, for example, driving. Take driving as an example. While driving, you need to update your working memory all the time, constantly, with your location, with the location of the other cars, with the road, with the speed, and so on and so forth. But most of the time, people do it seamlessly, effortlessly. They even manage to listen to the radio and hold a conversation at the same time, while constantly updating their working memory. So what's going on? Could it be that updating at some situations is quite easy? The view that updating is costly and effortful, the executive functions view, is in conflict with another idea in the literature that is quite prominent, I think, suggesting that working memory, the concept of working memory, is very close to attention. It suggests that attending to an item facilitates, not necessitates, but facilitates its encoding into working memory. And this idea echoes with earlier ideas by Gus Craig on levels of processing. The idea was that there is no such a thing as encoding. Encoding does not exist as a distinct process, but rather processing an item judging it, categorizing it according to some rule, applying a task to an item, all of this result in memory. Memory is a byproduct of processing. Now, applying these ideas to working memory updating imply that updating or encoding may be, in some situations, byproducts of attention. And if so, it could be that updating rather than not updating should be the default. And if that's true, updating should be quick and easy and seamless. So how can we explain this? We think that in this situation, so in this paradigm where people make a choice response time in each trial, people only have one item in their mind, right? And updating that item is carried out whenever they attend to an item. And specifically, it is a byproduct of the process of response selection of the X, O, right, left decision. It is automatic. People cannot avoid it. They perform it both when they have to update their working memory and when they not, both in red frames and in blue frames. So it's not that updating is faster than not updating, but rather it's not updating that is slower. When people need to withhold their updating, when they need not to update an item, they cannot avoid updating it, but then they have to go back and remove that updated item from working memory. It is this removal process, presumably, that takes the extra time, which is responsible for the longer response times in the no update condition. What happens with larger set sizes? So here's the same, almost the same experiment, but with the set size of 2 items. So at the beginning, there are 2 frames on the screen, and the participants need to remember both letters, X on the left and O on the right. Then in each trial, there's only one letter in one frame, in one of the sides of the screen, and the participants, as before, need to classify it as X or O, press the right key for X, the left key for O. And there are blue frames and red frames and so forth. And as before, at the end, they have a recall test, but here, at the end, they need to remember or to recall what was the most recent letter in the red frame on the left, and then what was the letter on the most recent red frame on the right. So people have to always keep in mind 2 items, although in each trial, they only have to process one of them. And boom, here are the results. So here, update trials are much slower than no update trials. This is the standard finding, right? The result that fits the earlier notion of updating as effortful and time-consuming and so forth. Why is it so? Why does the set size play such a critical role? So one difference between holding a set size of 1 item and holding more than 1 item is the need for binding. With more than 1 item in mind, people need to know what is the role or the position or the context of an item. So to say whether the X was on the right and the O on the left or the other way around, right? So it might be that updating a single item that does not require binding or association is easy, but when bindings are involved, it is the updating of the binding that is hard. The binding are the ones that take the additional time for it to get updated. There are other explanations, such as the serial scanning that we know that takes place in verbal materials. And there's another account or possibility that the conflict regarding which item to update you need to update plays a role, and we're currently examining these possibilities. Why still we get slower updating or an update cost in the reference back task? Because I think that here also there is a need to hold the context of each item. So whenever you see an item, say an X, you have to compare it to the reference. You have to know that what we see now is an X and the reference is O. So you have to keep these roles active rather than the other way around. So this situation again involves binding and hence the updating cost that we see. I'll just tell you briefly that we see the same update benefit in a procedural working memory. I won't get into the details. It's a task switching paradigm in which there's a series of queues telling people what the relevant task is, and people move through a sequence of queues and see one probe. They have to update their working memory with some of the queues, not update with other queues. And again, we see an update cost. Sorry, an update gain, right? Updating is easier than not updating in this task also. And again, the explanation is, as before, with one item in mind, updating is carried out as part of attending to an item, as part of response selection, as a byproduct of its processing. And when you don't need to update your working memory, you cannot avoid updating it, but you can remove the unwanted updating that took place. Okay, so the last part, a totally different study, but I think there's a connection between these two stories. We see that the number of items that people hold in working memory plays a critical role. Updating is fast when you hold one item, it is slow when you hold more than one item. And we know from about 3 decades of research that the mean capacity limit of working memory is about 3 items. So 3 items on average. There are individual differences, of course, but the average is about 3 items. And one of the major tasks used to demonstrate it is the change detection task, which was made popular by Luck and Vogel. Participants see a memory array consisted of colored squares. It's presented briefly and then disappears for 1 second or so, and then a test array or a probe appears. And the participant task is to indicate whether the test array is the same as or different from the memory array. If it's different, only the color of one, like here in this example, the color of one of the squares in one of the locations is changed. If it's the same, it's the same. And the main independent variable is the set size, the number of squares on the display. And the basic finding is this one. So this is accuracy as a function of the set size. So accuracy is perfect with 1 item and 2 items, and it's almost perfect with 3, but then there's a drop as the set size increases, and this drop is somewhere between 3 and 4, suggesting that the capacity is about 3 items. Anything beyond that cannot be remembered. The change detection task was used in thousands of studies. In all of them, as typically done in memory research, people are instructed what to remember, and they need to remember as many items as possible to succeed. So in this last study for my lab, we wanted to ask a different question. If people had choice, how many items would they choose to remember? We created a task that we call a reconstruction task. People see a memory array on the computer screen, similar to the one that serves in the change detection task, and they have to reconstruct it on another screen. So they do so by going back and forth between seeing the memory array and the reconstruction screen. And in each time they switch to the reconstruction screen, they can place there as many items as they wish. And they do so by pressing with their mouse, pressing on a specific location, and then picking the color of the square that appeared in that location, and then they could press a different location and pick the color, and then maybe they can go back and observe the model, right, the memory array again, and go back to reconstruction and so forth. And we are interested to see how many items people tend to reconstruct each time. In other words, how many items people choose to load their working memory with. And the result is about one item. Most people, most of the time, choose to remember one item, position it in the reconstruction screen, go back, remember another item, position it, and so on and so forth. In addition, we tested in this study the participants' working memory capacity with the standard change detection task, and the results are as could be expected. So a capacity of about 3 items. So people have a capacity of 3 items, but they choose to load their working memory 1 item at a time. They choose to underutilize their working memory capacity. Why is it so? We don't know yet. But one possibility is that it has something to do with the unique nature of updating when holding only 1 item in mind. It could be that since updating a single item is easy, people choose to hold only 1 item in mind most of the time, although they have the capacity to hold more. And the last puzzling result from this study that also speaks to the topic of the conference, we looked at individual differences. So although people choose to load their working memory with about 1 item, on average, there were stable individual differences in this tendency. Some people take more items each time, some take less. And there were, of course, individual differences in working memory capacity as measured by the change detection task. Both of these were highly reliable. However, to our surprise, they were uncorrelated. In other words, it is not the case that people with a larger capacity tend to load their working memory with more items and vice versa. There's something else that explains individual differences in the utilization of working memory, and we're currently working on finding what that thing is. So the take-home message is that working memory updating is a phenomenon or ability. It's not necessarily a process. It can be controlled. It may involve gating, may involve removal. It can take place perhaps automatically as part of attending to information. We learned that set size is a key factor. There's something special about holding 1 item, and we'll need to clarify exactly why. And it might be that flexibility or updating is the default and not stability, which is resisting updating. And finally, we still know very little, and as Paul Simon said, we find these effects to be still crazy after all these years.
You want to think? So you're done, or do you want to?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Any urgent question? One.
I was wondering, very inspiring talk, especially about the removal part. In China, it's a big issue now. Try to investigate the effect of working memory in depression. And as you know, depressed people tend to ruminate a lot. So according to what you say today, do you think they have more a problem with the removal than of the updating?
Yes, definitely.
It would be very interesting to test.
Yes, definitely there are works suggesting that removal is an issue in depression and also in anxiety. We don't still, I think we don't still have a good measure of removal. This is one of the problems. So there are several ways to test for it. I'm not satisfied with any of them yet. But theoretically, yes, I think this is a major problem. So it's not necessarily that negative content captures attention, but rather that people cannot get rid of that attention capture by removing it from working memory in order to free space for the relevant goal, relevant things. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Any other question? Inside, outside? No.